Great. We've got a really good group with us here, so I think we'll go ahead and get started and hope we get a few more as we progress through. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Callie Cornell, and I work with the Center for Collaborative Education. And we're really excited to have you join us this afternoon for our webinar focused on rubric design. Gary, if we could get to the next slide, please. And one more, please. Thank you. So before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping items to attend to. So just so you're aware, all participants will be muted throughout the webinar. And so because you'll all be muted, if you could use the chat box for any comments or questions throughout our hour or so here today. Members of our team will be monitoring the chat box throughout the webinar, and any questions that arise we'll be able to address as we go. And also, as an FYI, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted for you and your colleagues to view after this afternoon's live session. Next slide, please. So to begin with, we'd love for everyone to answer a few questions in the chat box. So you should see in your GoToWebinar control panel either a questions or a chat box there. And so we'd love in the chat box for you to tell us who you are and where you're from and what you hope to get out of this webinar. And if you wish, and also answer, what is your experience with rubric design up until now? And so we'll give you a few minutes to type those in. We've already got some answers rolling in. Thank you to Jessica and Drew. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm seeing answers still roll in, but we've got folks from Brockton and Burlington and Taunton and Woburn and Worcester. So it looks like we've got a really good representation from across the state. Thank you so much for being here. Gary, if we can move to the next slide. Team, and from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, we have Carrie Occasion and Jennifer Guakin. And then we have a robust CCE team. So the Center for Collaborative Education, some of us are on the webinar today, and some of us you might have seen at other technical assistance events or will meet us at some of the events in the future. And so we have Oscar and Diana, I'm Callie Cornell, Andres, Don, and our content expert today, Gary. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with CCE, it's a Boston-based organization whose mission is to transform schools to ensure that all students succeed. And we partner with educators and leaders nationally to develop strategies, processes, and tools that support this vision of schools that prepare every student to achieve both academically and make positive contributions to a democratic society. CCE is partnering with the Mass Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to provide technical assistance to the Innovation Pathways Community of Practice this year and for future years. And so particularly this year, we're hosting a series of site visits and workshops and webinars over the course of this spring and into early summer. And speaking of some technical assistance events, on the next slide, we have a couple more coming up this year. So we have a workshop on developing the student-mentor relationships, and that will be on Tuesday, April 14th. We've moved this from an in-person webinar, given our current circumstances, to a fully virtual workshop. And so you can register for that workshop at the link you see here on the screen. And we're also working to provide a site visit before the end of the school year, and details on the date and location will be coming to you pretty shortly. We're hoping to get that information out very soon. And so we have resources, technical assistance events that have already happened this year, including a high quality capstones webinar. All of that is accessible on the link that you see on the screen in front of you, which is a tiny URL/MA Innovation Pathways. And on this page, you'll see both the resources and events that have happened so far this year, and you'll be able to register for future events. Next slide, please. So your webinar organizers today, there are 3 of us here. We have Jennifer Guakin, who's the Innovation Pathways Lead at DESE, and you should be able to see her at the top of your screen there. We have Diana LeBeau, who is the Director of District and School Design at the Center for Collaborative Education, and myself, Callie Cornell, working on the Innovation Pathways Consultant with CCE. And we'll be here to answer your questions throughout the webinar. So as they come up, we're going to type those right into the chat box, and we'll be able to answer them along the way. And our presenter today, next slide, is Gary Chapin. So Gary brings a wealth of knowledge from his experience as a high school teacher and a former Maine Department of Education employee. He's a national expert on rubrics and rubric design. And from what I hear in his bio here, quite a fan of cheese Danish. So thanks, Gary. We're really looking forward to hearing from you today. Our goals for today are threefold. First, we're going to establish a common understanding of strong rubric design. We'll increase our understanding of how to develop rubrics for student-driven and career readiness projects. And then finally, to help navigate specific contexts for the Innovation Pathways designees that may consider using strong rubrics. And our agenda over the next about 50 minutes or so will be do some introductions, who we are, provide some overviews, which we've already done, and then we'll get into sort of the nitty-gritty content here. And so we'll talk about what strong rubric design is, how different schools establish the processes that support rubric design, and we have a few examples of rubrics to share with you all. And then finally, we'll make sure to leave time to answer any specific questions that you have. Next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So before I turn it over to Gary, I want to emphasize where the requirement for rubric use shows up for the Innovation Pathways designees. So in the requirement for assessing the end product, which is either the internship or the capstone experience, the guidance states that a well-developed rubric will govern student development of a high-quality end product, and successful products will be determined to meet or exceed minimums defined by the school and communicated clearly on a rubric. And so we hope that the information we share with you today will help you in your efforts to meet this requirement. It's also worth noting that DESE is exploring the development of internship rubrics, but those aren't developed yet. And so until we have statewide model rubrics to use and those are available, consider how the elements of strong rubric design that we share today can support your work, not only in assessing internships and capstones, but also in things like your formative assessment systems and student exhibitions, or sort of how you think about modifying existing rubrics that you may use. Next slide. And we'd also like to encourage you, as Gary shares information throughout this webinar, to keep in mind the 5 Innovation Pathways guiding principles. And we've generated a few questions to consider related to each of the principles as it relates to rubrics. And so for the guiding principle of equitable access, are standards and rubrics attainable by all students with their resources that are currently available? And we talk about all students, that's both your males and your females, racial and ethnic groups, economically disadvantaged students, students with disabilities, first-generation college goers, English language learners, and other populations of students. Can all students meet what the standards in the rubric dictate? And are the rubric descriptions clear and fair to all of those groups? In the guiding principle of guided academic pathways, is the rubric aligned to the intended competencies or standards that you're taking a look at, and does it demand the appropriate amount of rigor? Is it focused on quality rather than quantity of achievement for students? And the third guiding principle, establish student support. Does the rubric encourage a common understanding of feedback? And is the feedback in the rubric specific enough so that students know what to do for their next steps? And does it focus on the things that students can do rather than what's absent from the student work? We have 2 more guiding principles for you to keep in mind as we go through the connection to career. So do rubrics govern students' development of high quality end products? So are we thinking about this rubric as the anchor piece to some of the capstone or internship projects for students? And does the product, how it's defined to meet or exceed expectations, is that defined clearly within the rubric? And then finally, as you think about effective partnerships, the partners in your school, including both MassHire and your employer partners, use the shared rubric, and are there aligned expectations that are both academic and technical within that rubric? And do your scores consistently score for that student work with the same rating, both those that are school-based and your industry and employer partners. So I've shared a lot of sort of questions with you openly, but we wanted to make sure to frame each of these guiding principles and consider how each of these principles and their associated questions are represented in what Gary will share throughout the rest of the webinar. And as you reflect on your own rubric use, are you thinking about each of these questions that are here? Next slide. So as we go through, please at any point as a reminder, type your questions into the chat box. Some of the questions we'll answer right away if it's critical to the group's understanding, and others we might wait until the end to make sure we answer those questions. And with that, Gary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm looking at myself in the video and trying so hard not to touch my face. It's really a challenge. So here's what we're going to talk about. Back to what is a rubric, what's it for, and then we'll take it through how do you design, and then how do you use it, and then we'll take it explicitly into the Massachusetts context. So when we talk about rubrics, are we all talking about the same thing? A rubric is a tool that can be used for a bunch of things. It could be a description of success. It can be the promises that you're making to students and parents and to your colleagues and to yourselves. This is what we find important. This is what we are going to be grading you on or scoring you on. It's a learning tool for students. One of the opening statements was that it will drive. It said that the rubric will developing a good rubric will guide student learning, and there are ways to make that more possible beyond just designing a good rubric, which is a great place to start. But it's also it can be used in a lot of formative ways, and I almost think that's more important than the final summative use of a rubric. It can be an inspiration for students, and I know this might be a stretch for many of you, the idea that a rubric can actually be inspirational, but I just ask you to think to a time when you were learning and you checked your own understanding. So you were learning how to paint or to play a song or something like that, and you checked your understanding around your description of success, and you, even if you fell short of the goal, you still found it inspiring to go on. And it's also a vital piece of the assessment systems. The entire assessment system rests on the strength of rubrics. It's like a choke point where that guides the quality of the whole system. So, as always, you start with the end in mind. If you don't know what the target is, you won't hit it. If you have 2 targets, you'll only hit it 50% of the time. So if you have an unclear target or too many targets, then your rubric won't be helpful. And so these targets are your essential learnings. And Jessica in the question box asked about profile of a graduate, vision of a graduate, and specifically she asked if we'd talk to NEASC about their requirement to do profile of a graduate or vision of a graduate. I don't believe we have. I'm willing to be wrong about that, but the vision of the graduate that NEASC is doing and that we do and that Battelle for Kids does is an excellent process to coming out with your essential learnings and to start as a starting point of where to build your rubrics. What are you aiming at? So this is sort of a conceptual map of how you assess kids. So you've got your learning target in the center, and you're a teacher or you're guiding teachers, and there are any number of tasks you can use to produce evidence that the student has achieved that learning target. And then the tasks produce the evidence and you get a bunch of them together, all pointing back to the learning target. And what you'll notice is that there's not one piece here that proves that the learning target has been met, but there are a number of pieces of evidence. And what the rubric is doing is testing the quality of the evidence. It's not testing the viability of a proof. And so you have this learning target, and then you clearly you have more than one learning target. It's a system, and sort of the way it works is that you have the task that you're doing, and within it is the rubric. And for my science friends out there, this is sort of like mitochondrial DNA, which the task and the rubric are closely related, but they're also, they can be independent of each other. The task can't exist without the rubric, but the rubric certainly can exist without the task. And so they're very closely related. And then you have your system, which has a bunch of tasks in it, and they all have this rubric task relationship going on. And ultimately what you're doing is you're trying to assemble a body of evidence that will show, does the student know what you need them to know, or don't they? And we're really careful about that phrase, a body of evidence, because there are so many different indicators, so many different tasks that happen. You have student reflection, which is a valid source of evidence of learning. You have teacher observation, which is a valid source of evidence of learning. So often it's overlooked, and yet it's the most abundant thing happening in classrooms, teacher observation. You have common performance assessments, and then you have classroom level performance assessments. All of these things come together to create a body of evidence, and no one piece has to do everything. So it's really relying on an abundance of data points, and the rubrics are what tell you whether or not the data point meets the criteria. So what are the mechanics of a good rubric? Because it's certainly possible to have bad rubrics. So what makes a good rubric? So I'm going to pause for 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to answer in the chat box, or the question box, the chat box, I think. Whoops, sorry. Thinking about what qualities do you need to see in a rubric? Why are they important? And so I'm going to just set a timer for 2 minutes. I'm not checking my messages. I'm setting a timer for a couple of minutes to just give you time to answer that question. Thanks. So far, you guys are great. Oh, and I will try to talk more slowly. So I'm going to give you about 15 more seconds. So looking at the responses, what I'm seeing is that I feel a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir suddenly. You're looking for consistent scoring, clearly defined subcategories of skills. That's just one of a number who look at clarity as one of the most important pieces. There's a request for, not a request, but somebody says the rubric should be holistic. It should include a number of aspects that would allow the extent of the vision and goals for each student. Clear differences between scores, which is a function of coherence, so that the difference between a 2 and a 3 is not only clear, but perhaps even intuitive. Having a clear scoring guide, but the ability to also be flexible, if that makes sense. That is the holy grail, Cheyenne, and it does make sense, and it's hard. The rubric should be dynamic to allow for personalization and to be truly equitable, also very important. Thinking of a way to measure multiple types of activities or tasks that show mastery, such as written work, tests, projects, reports, and presentations. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to move on. I think at the end we can check in to see if we've hit all those points. I'm predicting that we might. So thank you, everybody. So the analytic rubric is sort of what we're talking about, and this provides feedback on various dimensions of the standard or learning target being assessed. It provides detailed feedback. It's consistent. It doesn't hide the deficits by trying to come to a single score for the entire assessment. And this makes it more useful as a formative tool, because if you're telling a kiddo you're getting an 85 on this, that's not as helpful as saying, well, in this you're meeting the standard, in this you're not meeting the standard, or you're meeting the criteria. I mean, I know that at some point you have to come to a grade, but not yet. They can be time consuming to write or score, but I would argue that they are worth it. They're also competency-based, and this is just a language problem in different places. They're referred to as competencies or standards. So I'm leaning on learning targets for this webinar. So ideally, you would have a rubric if it were aimed at a competency or standard or learning target, and you had 3 assessments that could assess that learning target. You could use a rubric for that learning target across multiple assessments. And so that's the ideal. And you may have to synthesize it a bit or distill it a bit so that it looks at how does this particular learning target enact, how is it embodied in this particular assessment. But still, if you're based in one standard, possibly it's an ideal to be able to describe success at that standard without having to, in a way that can be used in multiple assessments. And in that way, your feedback is still specific, there's still flexibility, but it's tied to the standards, it's referenced to the standards. So what we're talking about, all of the calls for clarity are referring to alignment. And alignment is has a number of dimensions. It's your learning goals, your targets, your standards. It's asking the question, does this assessment create evidence that actually does it assess the thing that I say I'm assessing? And then it also asks, does it assess it at the level that that the standard requires. So if you think of it like a thread that runs through the entire learning experience, where it starts at the learning target and then the thread continues through the instruction, continues through the student directions, it continues through the rubric, and then finally it shows up in the student work, that's the ideal version, or a metaphorically ideal version of alignment. And I think that as teachers, everybody knows how easy it is to drift away from alignment, so that if it's a STEM assignment and suddenly you're assessing spelling, then that's not in alignment. And I don't want you to understand that as me saying don't assess spelling. I'm just saying that if your rubric is assessing spelling, it should have its own separate row. It should be a separate standard that's called out, and not just sort of a proxy for quality. And then, so in the terms of depth of knowledge, what you're looking for is depth of knowledge 3 or 4, which, if you're unfamiliar with this, this is Webb's depth of knowledge, and he breaks learning into these 4 different categories, 4 different levels, and essentially any set of standards that's written these days is asking for stuff at a DOK 3 or 4 level, at the level of strategic thinking. So it's asking you to analyze things instead of describing things. So if this learning target says analyze Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, and your assessment is saying describe Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, then that's a disconnect in the level of knowledge. And typically DOK 3 stuff, or 3 or 4, that's where you're actually using the information or using the skill, rather than just showing that you have the skill. And so I'm not saying that everything you do has to be DOK 3 or 4, because DOK 1 and 2 get built upon to the point where you are then achieving DOK 3 or 4. But your ultimate assessments, where you're providing evidence that they've met the learning target, should be at the same level as the learning target. So there are a number of types of criteria that can show up in a rubric, and these all really depend on what you want to assess. And in this case, this really is up to your judgment which type of criteria is appropriate for the piece. So here are the 5 types that we talk about. So you have the accuracy type of criteria. So basically you're checking, is it correctly applied? Did they come to the right, does it match the outcome that you're supposed to have? Did they do the math right? These are all aspects of accuracy, and usually those are at DOK 2. Did they apply the correct formats and rules? So if you're doing a science experiment or a lab or a math piece or a document-based question, did they actually do the thing correctly? And did they apply the rules in the right way? And here it says it's mostly DOK 1, but that's not necessarily true, because if they took the form and applied them into a new setting, then that could be a higher depth of knowledge. So the form and the process are similar. Did they follow the right steps? The impact criteria is interesting because it can feel very simple, and it's essentially saying, did the assessment do the job that you needed it to do? So and so this might not be appropriate for all assessments, but did the debate performance, did they end up having a successful debate experience? Did they end up successfully enacting that character in a theater piece on stage? Or if you're in if you're in a tech center and the idea is that they're learning how to fix brakes, did they fix the brakes? That's a really important piece, because they can learn all sorts of new knowledge about how to fix brakes, but if they didn't actually fix the brakes, that's a really important gap. In a way, this is almost like the experience piece of learning. Can they do the thing? And that could be DOK 3 or 4, because that is application. That's almost the definition of application. And then finally, you have the new knowledge. Did the process attain new knowledge for the student? Did it take them to new places? Did they build on what they knew before and move into a new space? So this is a sort of a cheat sheet of what makes a good rubric, and this is actually at the link that Callie described earlier. And I really am trying to talk more slowly. If you need me to talk yet more slowly, please just let me know. And a lot of these things were called out in the chat before when I asked you to respond to that question. So do you have coherence between performance levels? So is the step between partially meets to exceeds, are they talking about the same thing? Are they connected to each other? So if your partially meets is if your meets introduces an element that hasn't been addressed in the partially meets or the doesn't meets, that would be a lack. That would be a point where there's no. I think that that would be a point where there's a lack of coherence if you didn't show a ladder of growth between the levels. But also, is the difference between the levels clear? And in this case, I specifically talk about level 2 and 3 because in a 4-point rubric, that's the difference between, often between not meeting and meeting. And that's the point where it's most important to be clear. The got it, don't got it divide. And when you're doing calibrations, which we'll talk about later, that's where the most arguments happen. And that's where they should happen, because that's where you're talking about what is enough. What is a sufficient amount of evidence? What is a sufficient quality of evidence? So is the difference between the 2 and 3, is it clear and is it reasonable? Is the description fair? Is it a description of success that can be attained by every kid? Does it have certain amounts of advantage for certain groups? Will it only work if the students have access to laptops, but not every student has an access to laptops? That's a pretty obvious example of that. Does the description focus on what students can do at the level of performance rather than what they can't do? Especially at the 3, the meets, does it describe what success looks like? And here sometimes there's a difference. Rubrics will be written in which they talk about what's required. Students submitted, like the assessment asks for 5 examples of something, and you say, and the rubric says student submitted 5 examples. Meeting the requirements and succeeding at the assessment are 2 different things, and that's a really important point, especially because it still happens. We see that all the time. You can have requirements that are not part of the rubric. These are the things you have to do in order to get to the point of the rubric. Did you write 3 pages? If you required 3 pages and they didn't write 3 pages, then it doesn't make it to the rubric to see what the quality of those pages are. So the description should talk about what they can do, what success look like. And I just actually leaked into the next point. Description focuses on quality rather than quantity. And then the other thing is that evidence has to be observable by both the teacher and the student. And this is like, I feel like for some people this is just so obvious, it's like, why is it even on the list? But for other people, this is why you can't having the rubric student understands. All you can talk about is what you can see, and the only things, whatever the student knows or whatever they understand or whatever level of analysis, all you can look at is what they do, their behavior and their product. And the rubric has to reflect that. So the most important thing about a rubric is the most important piece of it is the description of proficiency. And I'm using the word proficiency. For some rubrics, it's meets. For some, it's a smiley face. For some, it's a 3. But describing what does it mean to be proficient. Having your teachers agree on what it means to be proficient is probably the most important conversation your teachers could be having with each other. So in the rubric design process, the first thing you do is you decide on your learning targets. And we talked about this before. This could come out of just your teachers figuring out what do you need to do in order to meet the curriculum. This could come out of a process of vision of the graduate or portrait of the graduate. And then when you decide on the learning targets, then you have a conversation about what does it look like to be successful at this target. And you could do that alone, or you could do that with your team. I really, 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 I just could not strongly enough suggest that you do this as a team. I mean, my own personal way of collaborating is to write a draft and then share it with the team so that we have something to talk about. But that's a form of collaborating. Doing this stuff alone or in a vacuum is really hard, and it's really easy to go awry with that. So once you decide on the learning target and you get an idea of what would evidence of attainment look like, then you start by writing the proficiency column. And this is where people start to tend to get overwhelmed by questions about the mechanics, like, well, should it be left to right? Should it be advanced proficient partially meets, or should it be doesn't meet partially meets proficient advanced? And all of those things work. If you're just consistent with the kids and clear, then that's what's important. Also, later on, Callie will be talking about this, but rubrics, there are 4-point rubrics. I'm going to show you a 3-point rubric. There are 5-point rubrics, and there are even 1-point rubrics, which are my personal favorites. And there's none of those are the wrong answer. But for all of those, for every single one of those, you still need to be able to describe proficiency. So tips on writing proficient level if you're trying to describe proficiencies. Whenever possible, try to mirror the learning target. If it asks for analysis, then be sure to include analysis. Remember that any one assessment cannot prove mastery. There's this desire to overpromise with an assessment. If I can just do the one great assessment, then everything will be okay. No, you have to collect evidence, and then you have to collect it into a body of evidence, and all of those need to be done with rubrics, descriptions of success. Be sure that the evidence is observable, and if you do want to assess an internal process like perseverance or problem solving or critical thinking or creativity, do not shy away from using reflective writing or a reflective conversation as evidence of learning. It is completely legitimate as part of a body of evidence to ask the students to reflect on what they've learned. You couldn't use it as the only thing, but it is so powerful when it's done well. So once you have rubrics, how do different places support this? What has worked well? And here I'm going to focus on calibration. And calibration generally is necessary for reliability. It's where scorers get together, they all look at the same piece of student work, they score it, and then they reveal their scores, and you see if everybody reached the same point. And I got to tell you, I just described it in a pretty simple way, but it's the most powerful conversation you'll ever have. We have calibration processes, they're all over the place, but talking about, you know, I gave this kid 2, and here's the evidence in the piece of work about why I think that's a 2. We did a calibration with 8 teachers a few months ago where 2 of them said it was a 1, 2 said it was a 2, 2 said it was a 3, and 2 said it was a 4. So there was a lot revealed in that process, and it was super powerful and very revealing. And they said, wow, good thing there are no students in here with us watching us do this. I'm going to skip over that because time is of the essence. And so the calibration, it lets teachers see what students are doing in each other's classes, which is really important. Anything that breaks down the isolation of teaching, it makes you agree on what evidence is acceptable and how much evidence is accessible. It's a great way of servicing, of looking at, is this assessment producing the evidence that we think it should, and the rubric. The most common thing that happens out of a calibration session is people look at each other sheepishly and say, wow, I guess we need to work on our rubrics, which is great. That's exactly what they should be saying. And it also provides a forum for teachers to seek assistance. It's a really powerful thing for PLCs to do. And so we have some examples, and these are also at the link that Callie posted. So you can actually pull these across, pull these in, and so from the Dearborn STEM Academy, they have their Pathways Defense rubric. And you can see here they did a 3-point rubric that did emerging, developing, and proficient. They don't have an exceeds column, which I think is super cool. The amount of energy that's spent on the exceeds column is really amazing. It's really kind of amazing how many. So I urge you to look at this this rubric. It's really interesting. And then just to put it within a system, Lowell shared with us their evaluation system, the pieces that make up their evaluation system. So they talk about their grading and their academic obligations, and students submit a weekly journal. So there's that reflection piece. They talk about tasks and personal relationships. They have a capstone project, which is worked on throughout the whole year, and eventually they assemble it into a portfolio, which is sort of like an argument for the student is making. The student, through the portfolio, the student is arguing for their success in the program, which is great. That's fantastic. And I feel as if I've reached my end. That's all I've got. I haven't been able to follow the questions while, so I'm going to turn it back over to Callie.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. Thank you for sharing all that really good information. We're going to pause for a moment for questions. So if you've not already done so, if you could please send your questions in through the chat box. We'll be monitoring those, and our full sort of panelists here are all available to answer any questions that pop up from you.
We did get one question about whether you all can get samples of other schools' rubrics, like Dearborn's. I will note that when Dearborn sent it, they sent it with a caveat. They wanted us to see it and to share what they were working on. It is a work in progress, so we will ask if, I guess we'll follow up with them on the side to see if they can feel comfortable sharing it with a wider group. But I would say in general, I had put out a call a few days ago for anybody registered for this webinar to send us any examples you have. We got a few of them. If others could send them, I think it would be wonderful to make a bank of some of these available. And I would encourage you, if you want to, you'll see my email address at the end, send yours to me, and when you do, just indicate whether you're comfortable with it being shared with other schools. not necessarily as anybody's promising an exemplar, but just as ideas of what others are using and working on.
I want to call out two of the points. One is that rubrics should be created with input from partners, parents, students, teachers, and mentors. And in general, yes, as many voices as you can get in, it is super helpful. But specifically, I in my last few years as a teacher, I did create rubrics with students, and it was an amazing process when you ask them, so how, what should I see if I need to see that, I need to know if you know how to do this thing. What should I see from you? And aside from everything else, they were super hard on each other, which was, everybody thinks the kids will be easier on each other, but no, when you make them the judge, they are really hard on each other. And so I said I had two, but I only had one.
Another question I'm seeing is about whether or not you could, is there an advantage to one type of rubric or another in terms of, you've mentioned 5-point, 4-point, 3-point, and 1-point rubrics, in specifically thinking about high school age students versus younger kids?
I generally prefer fewer points. The 0 to 100 scale is basically a 100-point rubric, and so how can you argue the difference between an 83 and an 84? And so can you argue that so a 5-point rubric has more delineations than a 4-point rubric? Can you argue between partially meets 2 and a partially meets 3 and then a proficient 4? Can those be clear? And that's not a rhetorical question, that's a real question. Can you do it? I think the 4-point rubric comes closer, although I never found anything more discouraging than writing the 1 column. And I've sort of developed a reputation as being a champion of the 1-point rubric, which does just the proficient column and then allows the students, in conversation with the student, as you're looking at the student work, you look at where they didn't meet and where they've exceeded. And so the student is sort of writing their own partially meets or exceeds. And the reason for that is that there are a finite number of ways to meet the target, but there are an infinite number of ways not to meet it. And why do you want to waste time trying to list those when the students are so inventive? They will come up with plenty of ways not to meet the target.
Carrie, I see one more question before we jump in. I know Callie has a few more great slides for us. Somebody said, Gloria said that she believes any rubric we develop should consider room for students who require accommodations, thinking really about being equitable and respectful of disabilities. Proficiency may look very different for a student with a specific learning disabilities than for one who's an overachiever. I guess that's more of a statement than a question, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts about rubrics when you're accounting for a wide range of students with different needs and specifically students who require accommodations.
I completely agree, and I think Gloria earlier wrote about how important flexibility is, clarity and flexibility, sort of that balance. And this is why, I have this ideal in my head about descriptions of success that don't reference the actual product, because that's the way, so every kid has an entry point into the rubric, into the standard, how they can figure out how they're going to show you that they know this thing. That to me is the dream conversation. The student says, you need me to show you this thing. This is how I'm going to do it for you. So I could not agree more.
Great.
Thanks, Gary.
We appreciate that. Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on, but please, if you have burning questions, our chat box there is still open. So if we could click to the next slide, please, Gary. Thank you. So I mentioned this at the beginning, but wanted to make sure to circle back that the rubric requirement shows up in the way that you assess students' end products as part of the internship or the capstone experience. And we really want you to leave thinking about how might what was shared today impact how you design and develop the assessments of students' end products. How are you evaluating them? How can rubrics be helpful to you in that process and through the design of that process? And in our last few minutes, I'd like to share just a few resources. So we've talked a little bit about different point scale rubrics, but wanted to note that quite often in Massachusetts, we see a 5-point scale rubric. Just seems to be more common here in Massachusetts. A 4-point scale is typically seen more frequently nationally, but there's really no right or wrong way. So we heard there are 5-point and 3-point and even 1-point scale rubrics. And so there truly is no right or wrong way to approach this. If you are using or thinking about using a 5-point rubric, it really allows you to apply the principles that Gary shared to make some finer distinctions among those middle categories. And we often see that, as I said, in the sort of 5-point rubrics that are common in Massachusetts. In terms of a few resources to share with you, the Massachusetts Connecting Activities Network has an employability skills rubric, which can be found at the link that's shared on your screen here. So the rubric includes evaluating student performance related to 6 specific categories, and that's attendance and punctuality, communication, critical thinking and problem solving, motivation and initiative, teamwork, collaboration, and workplace culture and safety. And so if you hadn't already been familiar with this particular rubric, we thought it was a helpful resource to share on today's webinar. And then the third resource we wanted to make sure to share is the state's Model Internship Resource Guide. There are a lot of really excellent materials throughout the guide, but in particular, we wanted to point you to page 38 of this guide. And so on the link that you see here on your screen, on page 38, there is some information related to grading guidance and grading guidance approaches. And so ultimately, schools have determination of their grading approaches, and you can consider how the development of strong rubrics for internships and capstones might impact the work happening within your school. And the specific example that's given in the internship resource guide, you could click to the next slide, please, Gary, is from New Bedford High School. And so this, back one more, please. There we go, great. So the grading example that they give is from New Bedford High School. And so I'll give you a minute to read here what's on the screen, but really think about how strong rubrics can support each of these criteria in this example that's laid out by New Bedford. And we thought that was a sort of good example to give today. Before we wrap up, we did want to just quickly loop back around to the guiding principles as it relates to rubrics and rubric design. So we shared and sort of walked through each of these slides earlier today, but we encourage you and your teams to consider each of the guiding principles and the related questions as you develop or modify your rubrics. And all of the resources that we shared today, including these questions and any of the resources, are shared on a tinyURL website, which is on one of our last few slides here. So the resources, the webinar recording, any other information will be shared at tinyurl.com/MA Innovation Pathways, and you see that URL listed on the screen here. And with that, I don't believe we've seen any additional questions come in through the chat box.
We did actually have one, if you don't mind. I think we have a few minutes left. Was the question about whether or not we need to have, or schools would need to have, a different rubric for each pathway. I don't think there's a single answer to this. I think sometimes what works really well is coming up with sort of a template rubric, one that includes some categories that are related to school-wide goals and competencies, and that's specific, the specific goals behind the school's overall pathway experience for work-based learning, and built around some of the guidelines we have from, connecting activities and from the state around some of the universal things to aspire to. And then a few categories that could be specific to a specific pathway, or maybe even a specific student's goals, or aspects of the internship or capstone that student is particularly pursuing. That's one particular approach. Different schools may choose to go in different directions around that. I don't know if others on the panel have thoughts on that particular question.
I do not. You covered it.
I saw a thumbs up from Jennifer. So, um, any last questions? Let's see if there's any here. I think that's basically it for questions today, it looks like. So I will take the lead, I guess, to close us out and say thank you all for joining us today. And please visit down below. You should see the tiny URL that we are making available to you all. We will be more widely making it available soon to the entire community of practice with lots of resources, including from today. Again, you'll see my email address down below. That's the DLebeau one. Please send me any examples of rubrics that you've been using at your school that you feel like you're comfortable sharing with the wider community of practice. And we can include that right on the same website that we're assembling so that folks have a go-to space to see resources from this webinar and from the other activities that we're doing. Finally, you'll be hearing from us soon, ideally within the next 24 hours, about our upcoming event, which is becoming a remote event on April 14th, focused on supporting the development of the workplace mentor and student relationship. And we have a great panel that we've been assembling, as well as a lot of resources and ideas to share out with the wider community on this topic. So keep your eyes peeled for that email, and otherwise we look forward to connecting with you all very soon. Stay safe and healthy, and have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.